Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you guys haven't been waiting too long. This is going to be a short talk on the threat modeling concept, and we're going to be using Gen AI and LLMs for the same. So, for the uninitiated, here's a short primer on threat modeling. Threat models are structured iterative analysis of your software systems, and they're meant to add adversarial insights into your SDLC. But all too often, we see them being used exclusively during the design phases of development cycles. And that is for a good reason. It's simply because good threat modeling asks insightful questions about the architecture, about valuable targets, possible pitfalls, and the validity of potential fixes. However, like I just listed, right, the questions are quite insightful and they require a hugely well-versed group of stakeholders to sit together at every risk assessment that is being done. And it's only a matter of time before there are too many stakeholders, too many decisions to make, too many changes that have been made since the last iterative design, that the process becomes what is meant to be intensive turns exhaustive. And it becomes too technically demanding to actually give you good quality findings. And all too often, you'll find that threat modeling is slowly being relegated to your quarterly or annual review cycles and not doing as much work as you want it to be doing. And you will often see that your threat models are outdated or poorly drawn or less than useful than you actually want them to be. And you might be often you might often get to the point where you're not doing threat modeling at all simply because they're becoming too time consuming, or they're just like a repetitive task that requires several technical documents to be digested and associated with the potential risk vectors that are underneath them. And you can already see where I'm going with this. So if there is a way to cut through all the noise, to reduce the required expertise, to reduce the number of man hours that generally don't even outlast the next sprint cycle that you're getting into, you could arrive at actionable threat models that will actually be useful for what you want them in that very cycle. So that's exactly what we have Abhay to talk about today. And he has done several scores of threat models in the past. So his expertise is extremely valuable. Hello, Abhay. And could you tell us what you have for us today?
Thanks, Ganga. Thanks for that intro. First of all, I wanted to quickly apologize to some of the users or viewers on Vimeo. We've had this webinar platform on Vimeo, and I think there were some technical hitches, but nevertheless, we are going live on LinkedIn, and hopefully, all of you are joined in on LinkedIn because most of the people who are joining from LinkedIn anyway. So, first of all, very happy to be here. Thanks, Ganga. Thanks for that intro, and thanks for explaining the problems, but hopefully I can give some solutions today. So it's not just about the problems and threat modeling. God knows we have too many problems in the threat modeling space. So
Yep.
with that, and without further ado, I'm going to get started with this session. So for those of you tuning in on LinkedIn, this is where so right now we just have one place that we're streaming to, unfortunately, because we had that issue with our streaming tool that we had. But nevertheless, I just want to make sure that people can access this, and most of you are accessing it from LinkedIn. So thank you very much for that. Anyway, so first of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to talk about this subject that I've been working on over the last sort of 6 to 8 months now. I do admit that I've kind of slept on the whole AI thing. I had not given it as much attention as maybe I should have in the past. But then, when of course everybody woke up to the fact that Chat GPT happened one day, and then life was never the same again. And that was the same thing in my case as well. One day I realized that there's something called Chat GPT. Of course, I had done some data science courses and stuff like that, but I'd never really taken it that seriously, right? I'd never put in that kind of time and energy into understanding it to that extent. So once I saw Chat GPT, I was like, oh my god, this is an earth-shattering moment. This is something that I realized that could be a complete game changer for our industry. So that is where I I decided to go big on my understanding of this. Really took in a lot of time and energy to learn this. And of course, I'm still discovering. Things are still being created and discovered as we speak. So I'm really looking forward to this, to talking about this as well. So I'm just going to quickly start sharing my screen. Just give me a second while I do that. Now, I am going to bring in my screen, and I'm also going to be sharing the slides with all of you. So don't worry about it. I will be sharing the slides, I'll be making them public, and I'll be sharing them with all of you later on as well. Uh, so first of all, this topic was really inspired from a training that we've built recently called Rapid Threat Modeling with Gen AI and LLMs, and this really comes from a place that is very deeply problematic for a lot of teams. Right, a lot of teams want to do threat modeling. They really come at it with a lot of they come at it with a lot of sincerity. They come at it with a lot of intensity, but they seldom do it properly, and they end up having a tough time. They end up not doing it. They have so many issues with it, and essentially it drops off the map, or it does they do a terrible job of it, or they don't do it at all. There are lots of issues, but let's talk about how we can address that problem. So Ganga spoke to you about the problem statement. Let's talk about some of the problem statement a little bit more in detail, and of course the solution statement. So, for those of you who stay on till the end, you'll get a special bonus from this particular session. So, please stay tuned. You'll get this special bonus in terms of not just a demo that I'll be giving, I'll also be giving another special bonus at the end. So, do stay till the end. I will make it worth your while to the end. I think we're going to keep this webinar for up to about an hour with some questions along the way afterwards. But just let me know at any given point in time if you have questions. And at the end of the session, we will have Ganga read out some of the questions as well, right? So that is something that we're going to do as well. So let's get started with rapid threat modeling with Gen AI and LLMs. So let's a quick introduction of myself. I essentially run two companies. One is AppSecEngineer. Most of you might know AppSecEngineer because you might be using AppSecEngineer. I know a lot of you, especially who have registered for this, are users of AppSecEngineer. I know a lot of you are either evaluating or using AppSecEngineer in some small way, shape, or form. Some of you are using it at your companies. A lot of you are probably know AppSecEngineer a lot more than my other company, which is V45. And V45 is an application security services company. Essentially, that is the older company. I started that company. I've been on both sides. I've been lucky to be on both sides of the equation. I've been able to actually do things and do penetration tests, do threat models, do architecture reviews, do cloud security audits, and all of that stuff on the V45 side, and take all that research and learning and stuff and bring it to AppSec Engineer, where I train, and my team and I build training material on AppSec Engineer. So we're one of the AppSec Engineer does self-paced training for DevSecOps, secure development, threat modeling, Kubernetes security, cloud security, all three big major clouds. We also recently launched an LLM security learning path. So do check that out if you have a chance. I also train at some of the world's leading events and conferences. This year, for instance, I'm training at Black Hat and DEF CON both, so I'm really excited about that. I'm looking forward to it. I love automation. Automation is really something that I enjoy working on, and that's kind of a little bit of my interest in this space, right? In in AI and Gen AI, leveraging that because it is the ultimate automation, right? So Gen AI is one of those things that can you can leverage it to automate and industrialize at a massive scale. So that is something that you can do with Gen AI, and I'm a big time proponent of automation. So I also have a threat modeling as code project called Threat Playbook, which I released on GitHub. In fact, I was one of the people who were the earliest to the cut, probably 2018 or 2017. I was building threat modeling automation. So I've always been thinking about threat modeling and automation and everything in between, right? So that is what I've been doing so far. Now, let's talk about a little bit of my background in Gen AI, and you'll see from the image here that I am an expert in Gen AI, which means I'm really not an expert. I'm just somebody who is very curious, constantly likes to tinker around and try to figure things out. Uh, I've been obsessed with my of with Gen AI, especially recently. I've been working on it quite a bit over the last 6 to 8 months. I've built solutions for customers. I've built solutions for AppSecEngineer itself. I've done a lot of work on it in the last 6 to 8 months that I've been working on it for. I've also built training on AppSecEngineer for LLM security, things like prompt injection and so on and so forth. So I've been doing that for a while now, and I intend to see that. I think we are just starting off, especially with Gen AI and LLMs. I think we're just starting off. We're just at the tip. I think there's ways to go and a lot more things that you can do with Gen AI and LLMs. So that is something that I'm really looking forward to as well. This topic, like I said, was born from a course, and this course is something I teach companies. I recently just finished teaching this course at a huge SaaS company, and they were like blown away because they were able to do things that they took weeks and months to do in minutes. So that's something that the course really was. We created this course, and in fact, one of the things we're doing after this is doing a boot camp of this where you all can participate as well. Now, let's quickly talk about the agenda and get cracking. Threat modeling, we need to do it, but we're bad at it. What do we need to do to fix it? Gen AI and LLMs, possible solution. How can we use Gen AI and LLMs, and how can we leverage that for threat modeling? Right. So basically, we were starting off with some of the issues that we find with threat modeling. I am sure that a lot of you have issues with threat modeling, right? A lot of you face constant issues with threat modeling. Gen AI and LLMs are here to help that particular, to help you solve this problem, in my opinion, and it can help you address it in a very meaningful way. It can help you address it in a meaningful way such that you still have the benefit of having humans at the driving the seat, driving the car, but still the car is kind of self-driving, right? In many ways, so you have the ability to do that with Gen AI and LLMs, especially for threat modeling. And I'm very excited about the prospect of this. Remember, I do have demos. I'm not somebody who just talks about this stuff. I do have demos. I have built a very interesting demo just for this session. So I'm really looking forward to showcasing that. That's going to come at the end of the session for everyone as well. Now, if you look at our the history of what we've done in the application development space, if you look at DevOps, or if you look at Git, if you look at cloud or infrastructure as code, one thing that has remained constant in the way we build applications is that we have constantly reduced constraints, which means that we have tried to go faster and faster and faster and faster when we've built applications, and we have, right? We've deployed applications faster. We've built applications faster. We have reduced the friction, increased the velocity. We're doing all of this constantly. This is happening all the time, and there's always more and more things. Now they're talking about things like Devin and Open Devin or whatever it is, being able to use AI to just write the code. We have tools that use AI to fix the code. So again, this is increasing the velocity in an extensive way, in a very, very meaningful way when it comes to application delivery. And we've always had this history of reducing constraints. We've never slowed down. We've always looked to increase velocity. Now, when you looked at increasing velocity, obviously security is something that you need to keep in mind. Now, when you look at the application development cycle, or the software development life cycle, as we call it, the SDLC, you will see that there are multiple activities in the SDLC. And a good security program essentially captures multiple security activities at each stage of that SDLC, right? A good security program captures uh, multiple security activities at each stage of the SDLC. It's embedded at each stage of the SDLC. That's very important for everyone to understand, right? So threat modeling, you'll see, is right up here, front and center. It's the ultimate shift left. I always call threat modeling the ultimate shift left, because threat modeling you can do at a particular point in time where you don't even have the vulnerability yet. You don't even have the application perhaps yet, right? You can do threat modeling at that stage. So that's the ultimate shift left, right? So if you're looking at shift left like static analysis or source composition or DAST or whatever it is, the real shift left, the OG of shift lefts, if you will, is threat modeling. And that's something that you should be leveraging quite a bit, right? So threat modeling is one of those key activities that you'll see at the planning stage, and you will see that threat modeling has a deep impact on all of the other stages that go by after this as well, right? So threat modeling has an extensive amount of impact on all of the different stages that go after this. So that's something that you should keep in mind as well. Now, when it comes to our secure software development lifecycle, which is what we want, right? We want our applications, our software to be secure right from the get go. We want it to be secure by default, secure by design. We want all of those good things. Now, which essentially means that we want to be able to find and fix bugs early and often. We want security to be embedded at multiple stages of the SDLC. We want automation of many of these security tasks, which is why a lot of us have invested in DevSecOps, we've invested in automation processes, and we also want to be able to eliminate vulnerabilities at scale. We want to be able to proactively eliminate vulnerabilities at scale. So, for instance, let's say an SQL injection is something that you want to be able to eliminate at scale, because you shouldn't. It should be something that becomes like table stakes after a certain point in time. So remember that these are the things that we want, and we are especially interested, especially from a threat modeling perspective. These two things are really something that we are really interested in doing from a threat modeling perspective. We want to find and fix bugs early. We want to proactively eliminate vulnerabilities at scale. Both these things are going to be something that really we want to do, and this is something we need to do, right? If we want to, uh, if we want to ensure that we have a solid security program. All right. Now, threat modeling, like I said, is one of those things that has an impact on everything, right? It has an impact on everything. Because threat modeling is those, if you do a good threat model, if you generate a good usable threat model, right? The key word here is usable, right? If you generate a good usable threat model, then you'll see that impact of that threat model is has downstream impacts everywhere else. If so, for instance, if you do a good threat model, you identify countermeasures, you can hand it over to developers to implement those countermeasures. You can hand it over to DevOps to implement those countermeasures in the infrastructure. You can hand it over to cloud engineering to implement those things. You will see that there are downstream effects of doing a great threat model from the get go, right? So this is something that is huge. So threat modeling is one of those things that can have a massive downstream impact. And threat modeling is also a requirement. Remember this: threat modeling is not just a nice to have, right? Threat modeling is not just a nice to have. Threat modeling has become an essential requirement. Now, anything that has a risk centricity to it, which is almost all compliance requirements, all regulatory requirements, end up going down the risk centric route. They all require you to do some kind of threat analysis, which is basically, uh, threat modeling. So NIST SSDF, which is being used by a lot of companies who work with the US DoD and federal government organizations, they have to do threat modeling for their products. In fact, I think there is a mandate by the CISA for threat modeling to be done on medical devices and so on. I recently learned that Singapore Cybersecurity Act also mandates threat modeling for companies that they designate as critical infrastructure. PCI DSS 4.0, which is kicked in officially. Those of you who are not aware of PCI 4.0, it's come in. It's right now a reality. 31st March 2024 is when it kicks in. So for those of you who are required to be PCI compliant, lots has changed. At the same time, threat modeling is one of those things that has kind of remained steadfast, actually, ever since I was doing a lot of work in the PCI space till now. Uh, Threat modeling is something that applications need to undergo. Even this, and I'm sure there are other requirements, other compliances that require threat modeling as well. I've just captured a few of them here. Now, but all of this is great. Threat modeling is good. We know we need to do it. We know we have to do it. We know we want to do it. But let's look at some of the problems. The way we do threat modeling today really sucks, right? The problem with threat modeling today, let's talk about a few problems with threat modeling. And these are real problems. I do threat models every week. I work with our customers to do threat models every week. This is something I see all the time with them. or when they're trying to improve. This is typically what I see, at least at the early stages of when they're trying to improve, right? So these are common problems I see, and I am sure many of you will agree. And if you do agree, somebody says FedRAMP also mandates threat modeling. Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm quite sure it does. I'm perhaps not as familiar with FedRAMP as I am some of these, but thank you for that. FedRAMP also mandates, which means that anyone who is running government workloads needs to comply with threat modeling. So the way most of us do threat modeling sucks, right? And let's talk about why it sucks. It sucks, first of all, because it takes time. It takes a lot of time. Now, the way we do threat modeling, especially system threat modeling, takes a lot of time. We have to gather all of the information. We have to break down the components. Need to get to security objectives. We need to do a threat analysis. We need to sit through multiple meetings where we validate and invalidate those threat analysis. Then we need to come up with countermeasures. Then we need to blah 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 blah. We need to draw fancy diagrams, by the way, don't forget that. All of those things need to be done, and unfortunately that takes a while. And by the time the threat model is even created, you'll realize that nobody's actually invested in this process. Nobody really cares about that. They're just going about their work as usual. Nobody uses the threat model. It's just something that's done, like a checklist thing, many times. And I'm not saying most of the time, but at least many times it's done this way. And unfortunately, it just doesn't keep pace. It just does not keep pace, right? So this is a problem with a lot of the threat modeling efforts we do. Now, a lot of times teams struggle with threat modeling, and I'm even talking about very, very solid, very, very skilled security teams, because there is so much inconsistency in the way you identify threats. Especially one of the big parts, I've always seen this. Yeah, somebody says they mostly do it for audit purposes. Absolutely, they mostly do it for audit purposes too. I agree. But one of the things that I constantly see with threat modeling is that teams really struggle with threat modeling, because there may be one member within the team who's really good, who has excellent security skills, who's seen both the offensive, the defensive side. They understand this in a great deal of detail. Then you have other members of the team who are not really there yet. And again, when let's say you're a company that has 300 different software products being created, and you have embedded people in these teams and all of that stuff, you'll see that there is a huge inconsistency in the skill. And this is a pretty big skills gap that you have with threat modeling. A lot of people, a lot of companies don't do it. A lot of teams don't do it at all, or don't do it well, because their teams they have very inconsistent approaches to achieving their threat model. So that is something that I constantly see with a lot of these threat models. Right? And of course, a lot of times we have the worst kind of incentives. I spoke about this the other day. It became a very popular post on both LinkedIn and Twitter, where we do a lot of threat modeling, and we seem to be focused extensively on creating diagrams. We don't seem to be actually focused on creating or identifying threats. So we create a very crappy threat model, which is just largely diagram centric. Doesn't really matter. But we use diagram as the output and not as just one of the inputs to a better threat model. So a lot of times you see some of these issues, and this is a problem. A lot of companies have this problem. A lot of teams that I work with and I've seen all over the place have this issue, and it's just not usable. Right, at the end of the day, you will see that a lot of the threat models that we produce are just beautiful documents that are PDFs that have several hundreds of pages sometimes. I actually recently came across a threat model that was about 250 pages long. I don't know who reads that, but it was a lot, and I don't see anybody reading it. Developers who are supposed to use this to address countermeasures are not reading it. Architects are not reading it. Even pen testers who are supposed to leverage this for their work product are not reading it. It's not usable. The threat models are just not usable. They're not artifacts that can be usable. That's the big problem. Right, now let's talk about how Gen AI can help. And in this webinar, please mind you that I'm not going to go into a data science lesson. I'm not going to talk about what is an LLM and what Gen AI is. We all, I mean, I expect that some of you may know it, and if you don't, I expect that you can check this out on YouTube or whatever. The idea here is that we have large language models which are trained on massive data sets. Um, uh, So we have a question. We started to see a lot of tools that are trying to codify threat model, like implement standards like OTM. Love to hear our take on this. I have seen one or two. I have not studied them in detail enough to pass judgment on them, but I have not really looked at it with that much detail. I'm sure it's going to be a hard thing to codify a threat model because everybody produces a different set of artifacts with threat modeling. I'm sure it's not an easy task, but I do have to take a look. I've seen one or two just in passing. Anyway, so how Gen AI can help? So Gen AI with LLMs, you really have data, massive models that are trained on massive sets of data. It could be text, it could be images, it could be what have you. The idea here is through the transformers architecture, they are able to deliver a very meaningful and contextual response to a lot of the questions that we have, a lot of the inputs that we pass, right? So we pass them prompts and essentially say, do this, and they come up with an output based on the understanding the prompt, understanding the output. They predict the next token, and using that process, they come up with the output. That is in at a very 50,000 feet in the air, what an LLM does, right? Now, let's focus on what they can do to help us. Now, the first thing that I see that they can do is increase speed exponentially, right? So you can go from weeks to minutes, months to minutes with Gen AI threat models, right? Now, can they do 100%? They can probably get you to an 80 or a 90%, but I think that is a lot compared to where we were before for most of us, right? And if you have existing capabilities, you can always enhance that to a certain extent. So it can get you most of the way there. That's one of the benefits of threat modeling with Gen AI, right? It can really push the boundaries of getting you most of the way there. It can be leveraged for any kind of security review, really. It's not just threat modeling, it can be leveraged for anything. It's just a question of being able to understand the prompts and how the prompting process works, and how the LLM engages with those prompts. It's not always perfect. It's not obviously a perfect science where you can say that, okay, this prompt exactly produces this output. It's probabilistic. LLMs are probabilistic. So you can use this for system threat models. So let's say you're looking at an entire system, you want to threat model that system, or what I call an agile threat model, where you're threat modeling just a feature. So let's say you have a particular feature or a set of user stories that you're threat modeling in a sprint. And this is something I teach a lot in my classes as well, where you talk about instead of system threat modeling is on one side, but let's say you want to implement a process of continuously threat modeling your products, then agile threat modeling is the way to go, because you can threat model user stories or features as part of the sprint planning process. And that also can have a huge time factor saving, right? That's a massive saving in terms of time. Now, the other thing that Gen AI can help with and LLMs can help with is generating a standardized set of artifacts, right? One of the big problems with a lot of teams is that they don't have usable threat modeling artifacts, right? Now, whether that artifact may be code or whether that artifact may be something else, it can produce a standardized set of usable artifacts. That's the most important thing. The artifact needs to be concise enough that it's usable. The artifact may not be the entire threat model, maybe one part of the output of a threat model that's given to a particular team, and that is something that you can do as well. And the idea here is to leverage human augmented patterns, right? The idea is to leverage human augmented patterns. Now, what does that intrinsically mean is that you are, so this is just to give you an idea, some of the use cases that I have used this with. I have used Gen AI and LLMs for system threat modeling across multiple methodologies. I've used this for agile threat modeling. You can use this for multiple different agile threat modeling approaches. I've used this for security architecture reviews. I continue to use it a lot for this. Product security reviews, questionnaires, audits. You can literally leverage LLMs for a lot of this stuff. It's just a question of how you want to use it, what input you give it, what is the specificity of the output you want. All of those things make a big difference in this particular case, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about one big question that I get. Does this replace humans? And is it going to be like this, right? Um, so the short answer is no, right? I don't think it replaces humans simply because, like with everything else in security, you need to verify results, right? You need to, I mean, the word triage is overused sometimes, but you need to triage simply because threat modeling, LLMs do produce hallucinations sometimes, they do hallucinate. And if you don't verify, you'll end up producing some, in many cases, some inaccurate data. So you need to verify, and somebody who can, the verification, even though it may not be somebody who is like super skilled, they can at least understand from the basics that, okay, this may be right or this may be wrong. So I think inherently threat modeling needs verification validation, because otherwise it will just become a very bad or a very unnecessarily uh, over scoped activity, right? Again, it's also important to understand that the way you create your inputs for your prompts in the threat model, or for an LLM generated threat model, is very important in producing very, very specific outputs. If you produce all kinds of, if you just give it very broad or vague outputs or inputs, it's going to produce very broad or vague outputs. So this is something that you should keep in mind for threat modeling, and it's not going to replace humans. So the way I see it is that it's going to, it is, I'm sure you've seen this quote all over the place. Will an AI replace you? A human with AI will replace you, right? That's the, that's a very, that's a very kind of reductive way of looking at it. But the idea is um, that really it is meant to, I think, accentuate human creativity and not, and that's why you need a human even today at the process. I think it's very important to have human beings in the verification, in the way the patterns are created, and so on. So somebody asked me any specific LLM models that would be used to carrying out threat modeling exercise. You can use any LLM model. There are some that are a little bit better than the others. Obviously, your OpenAIs are trained on more data sets, your Anthropics, your OpenAIs, but you also have some very good open source LLMs like Llama and Lava and Mistral. Of course, I don't think Mistral is entirely open source anymore. But yeah, you do have a lot of models. So human prompts and patterns are very important for you to get the best out of this. Remember, this is a very pattern and prompt based thing, right? If you are able to create these patterns well, you are able to also leverage these patterns in a way that can give you the best possible outputs, and which you need to verify, of course. That is something that you need to keep in mind. And again, remember, with, just like I would say this across the board, even if you're doing threat modeling by yourself as a human person, right? Uh, Defining specific requirements for the outputs give you a very good output and give you a very good value for your threat model. And that is still a human led activity. So that is something that you should keep in mind. So that's what you need to understand. So the way I see it, our approach, the approach that I take, I teach in the classes as well, and I'm planning to teach the same approach in the boot camp as well, that we're going to do in June. So basically, the idea is that we have a task. We have this big task that I need to do a threat model. Now, this task obviously needs to be broken down into multiple components. So one of the components of the task could be that I need to identify the system, identify the components of the system. I need to identify the security objectives of the system. I need to identify the threat scenarios related to the system, and then I need to identify the countermeasures, and I need to identify whatever. The You have a process of doing it. So the idea is to go from this big, massive, contiguous task, which is we need to do a threat model, to breaking it down into components and capturing each sub piece, or each problem statement or the component into a pattern, and passing this pattern along with all your input into an LLM, and the LLM generates the output for that pattern. So you can give it a scenario and say that, hey, for this, please generate uh, a bunch of please generate the security objectives for this system, right? Uh, and it will generate the security objectives for the system. please generate the threat scenarios for these security objectives and this information assets and these components that I've captured. Then it will do that. So the idea is to go one after the other, not expect this one big problem to be solved at one shot. So I have a question. Yeah, exactly. To bring in human perspective, exactly. The idea here is to capture this to be a sidekick. I couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you, Ashish. Uh, to become really an assistant for you, right? That's really how you can leverage LLMs to do this. And LLMs today can do this in multiple ways. LLMs can also process text input. They can process visual input. In fact, the demo I'm going to show you is from our class, from the boot camp and the training that we do, where it's going to read a diagram and it's going to interpret that diagram as well, right? It's only interpret the diagram and say that, okay, these are the components in that diagram. And it's going to tell you that, hey, this is the things in that particular diagram, right? So it's going to actually do all of these different things. And each of this is loaded as a pattern. So one of the tasks is going to be create security objectives, break down the components, come up with threat analysis, come up with countermeasures, blah, 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 blah. And then finally you produce your threat model based off of all this, right? So you fed into the output, and of course, you can chain a bunch of outputs and produce a whole threat model. That's basically it, right? So you'll see how I can go within the time I do the demo, which is probably going to be a 15-minute demo. I'll have a full threat model, right? And it's really powerful. So, the idea in this approach, or the benefits of this approach, is that you can write it in natural language, like you would write any other technical document, right? You would write out system. You would just provide it a diagram. I'm sure a lot of us have diagrams in our documentation, or we can just create a diagram, a basic diagram, and just put it in there, and the AI understands that. Uh, Would you do an AI-driven threat modeling in a workshop setup with many attendees? Yeah, absolutely. You should actually, if you do this as a meeting, uh, and I've done this as an assisted threat modeling meeting for a lot of companies, and that really produces some great inputs because you're able to take the outputs of each pattern and come up with small changes or verify some things, remove some things, and then feed it into the next step and do that, so on and so forth. So yeah, absolutely. So anyway, so the idea of this approach is that the patterns are entirely written like you would write a Markdown document. Anyone who's written Markdown, or forget Markdown, even if you have written it into a text file, that's perfectly fine. So you don't need to know any code required. No code is required really. You can even pull it from existing documentation. And the idea here is that at each step you are producing useful artifacts. Each step you are creating and producing useful artifacts. And the idea here is if you have these patterns captured in your company, you can replicate it at scale. So let's say you can do this for across 300 different teams, you can easily replicate this at scale. So that's the benefit of this approach, right? So that's really powerful what you can do with GenAI. So this now is the time for my first demo, and I'm sure all of you are looking forward to this. Um, so this, I'm going to do a full threat model where I'm going to go from here here to the countermeasures. I'm obviously not going to do the document and monitoring part simply because that's really a security monitoring activity. So this is based on the NIST SP 800-154 threat modeling methodology. Now, those of you who are not familiar, it's a great methodology for threat modeling. It's a very interesting, straightforward methodology for threat modeling. And what I'm going to do is I am going to essentially capture the security objectives first. My AI is going to capture security objectives. It's going to break down the system. I'm going to give it a diagram. It's going to read that diagram. It's going to break down the system. It's going to do all of that good stuff. Okay. Then what's going to happen is we're going to do a threat analysis. Then we're going to do a threat analysis. The threat analysis can be done. The AI is going to do the threat analysis as well. Then we're going to feed in the results of these two things into the likelihood and impact score of the threat analysis, and then identify the countermeasures. Right. So that's something you can do. Now, I have a question. The prompts require sensitive data to perform the TM. why would a company accept us sending sensitive data to a company like OpenAI when we don't know the data being used, contracts are in place? Now, yeah, this is a good question, and a lot of people have this question. Now, most of the companies that we work with typically deploy their own LLM variants, right? So, in the sense that they don't use the public OpenAI, they use the Azure OpenAI because that is obviously something that they don't want to open it up to everybody else. And Azure OpenAI, I'm sure, has requirements in place where if you are an Azure customer, you can do that. There are lots of private LLMs. So let's say you don't want to go with OpenAI, you can go with private LLMs that you can deploy and run and do the same thing. It's not necessary that you need to do this on OpenAI, public OpenAI, at least, yeah, OpenAI the OpenAI public API. You don't need to use it at all. You can use entirely walled off Azure variants or Anthropic enterprise variants or AWS, Amazon Bedrock, or any one of these, you know, uh, cloud deployed on your own cloud AIs, or you can decide to go with a fully open source LLM that you deploy on infrastructure that you control, and that can be done. The same things can be done there as well, right? So, yeah, that's a good question, and I think that is an important question to address before we get into the demo. All right. So let's get started with our demo. The first thing we are going to do, just give me a sec while I pull up my screen. Okay. So I'm going to explain the scenario first and then explain. So this is an actual lab from the course that from the boot camp that we run, and this is going. So if you do the boot camp as well in June, this is a lab that we'll be running as part of that as well, and we have several labs that we run as part of that. So I'm going to explain this concept just a little bit before we actually get into the lab itself. Just give me a sec. Something's up with this. All right, perfect. Okay, so we have this system that we're going to be threat modeling. Not this, needs to change. Here we go. We're going to be threat modeling this system, and I'll explain the system here. So this is the scenario that we have created. You'll see that all the stuff in the side are the different labs that we have. So here you will see that we have created this scenario, and we are going to be using this particular scenario. Um, uh, this particular scenario, right? So this is, and we've taken some context. Large electronics manufacturing company, they have a expense management system that they're going to be deploying, or they've already deployed. This system is hosted on AWS. Now the idea here is that this is like a corporate expense management application, and company users can upload their expenses to the system, and project managers can approve it, and this happens across the company. So it's a huge system. It runs on AWS, and this particular system we've given it a diagram, right? We've given it a diagram. So we have this. It runs as a container. It has container registries. It is authenticating through SSO SAML with Azure Entra. It uses Amazon Cognito. It uses synchronization service. Once the the expenses are approved, it uses a synchronized service and pushes it to the enterprise ERP. So this is the scenario that we have, and we have some information related to that particular scenario. Right now, what I'm going to do is we are going to run a full threat model from the scratch, right, so to speak. We're going to run a full threat model of this. We're going to take this scenario, what you see on screen here, and we're going to run a full threat model. So the idea here is we're going to pass this text data to the LLM. We are also, so it has some information about the technology, the features, everything. It also has the diagram. So we're also going to pass in the diagram to the LLM, which means that the LLM is, we have very specific instructions to the LLM, the prompts, very specific prompts to the LLM that will require the LLM to capture all of this in and capture all the components and use the components to come up with threat scenarios and security objectives. So the first task for the LLM that we are going to do is come up with security objectives and capture a data dictionary for the uh, that is basically the LLM, right? So that's capture the objectives, security objectives in the data dictionary. So let's actually go ahead and do that. I just need to make a small change. Yeah, I need to make a minor change to this. So this, I'm running on my local machine. So it's the reason I need to make that small change to this. All right. So let's actually run this. All right. So now we can just pass in so the utility that I'm using here is something that we train you on in the course and how to build the prompts and all that stuff. But in this case, I'm just going to show you the output of that utility. So I'm just going to say that, hey, read the data from this particular directory, which is objectives and dictionary, and come up. Essentially, we'll, yeah. So the question is, essentially, we'll feed it the DFD. You can, yeah, you're feeding it the DFD as well as the textual explanation. So it has both. So just the DFD might give it only some data points, but if you give it more than just the DFD, it gives you yeah, more context. Exactly. So we're going to run this, and this is going to generate security objectives. This is also going to generate a data dictionary, right? That's what it's going to generate. So based on all of the analysis that it's going to do, it is going to generate this and create an output file for us. Okay, and the output file is something that we are going to parse and see what are the outputs, right? So it's basically passing all of this. It's also passing the diagram. The diagram is configured to work with a vision model, which actually reads the image like a human reads an image, and actually the prompt is set up in such a way that it captures all the components and comes up with whatever data you want it to. In this case, the two data points, we want security objectives, we want a data dictionary, right? Now the output has been created. Now let's look at what the output is, and let's actually preview it in a much better format. Right. So you'll see that the security objectives. Now remember, this is an expense management system. So the security objectives have been framed with that system in mind. So it's clearly understood that including personal employee expense information, blah, 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 are only available to authorized personnel, which is very relevant. Guarantee accuracy of the expense. So these are high level security objectives, right? We want to capture this before we actually get into our threat analysis and countermeasures. That's why we capture security objectives. We also capture information assets, and you'll see that it has been able to read a lot of information from the diagram and use all of that to create uh, its outputs, right? So in this case, it's employee personal information, etc. It's basically saying that, hey, this might have all of this, and it's not wrong. It's absolutely right. Expense information might have the business purpose, expense reports. All of these are information as synchronization logs are the information assets, authentication and authorization data information assets, source code within GitHub Enterprise information assets, right? So all of these things, it's automatically generated all of these things because we have specified a very specific type of prompt to be able to do this. Now let's actually go ahead and go to the next step, right? Now we'll take the outputs of this and we will paste it into the inputs of our next step, right? So the inputs of our next step is where we want to generate threat scenarios. We want to generate threat analysis for this. And I'm going to make a small change. So I can do stride threats, but I'm not going to do stride threats for this. I'm just going to say generate threat scenarios, because stride, I mean, stride is typically required for humans. For systems, based on the description and the security objectives, based on the, I'm going to change this on the fly, and information assets. I'm going to remove the stride. Again, if I had given stride, it would capture the stride as well. So if those of you are stride fans, it can capture that, but I wanted to not do that. So that's the reason I'm doing it this way. Okay. So now I will go ahead and run this, just the same thing. Instead of the objectives and dictionary, I'm going to do a threat analysis. Now here, you'll see that what I'm going to do is it's going to run the threat analysis, and it should give me, based on all the inputs that it has here and the image that it reads again and the context that it's gotten from the beginning, it's going to give me the threat scenarios. And it's going to give me a threat scenarios in a very specific format. Threat actor uses threat vector to attack outcome, so their attack motivation, right? So it captures the threat scenario in a way I want the threat scenario to be captured. So that's what it does. Hopefully that should be done sooner than later. So it does take a few seconds for it to process. Obviously, we're sending it a lot of data. The context window is pretty loaded up, and it's done. So let's look at the output, and let's actually examine the output in a nice readable way. So you will see that now it has captured threat scenarios, and you will see that it has captured very specific threat scenarios. An external threat actor can do a distributed denial of service attack to overwhelm the API gateway. So it's read up the fact that it's seen the diagram, it's analyzed the API gateway in the diagram, it's analyzed that the Fargate services are backed by the API gateway. As a result, it's used that context to identify the distributed denial of service attack. So again, AWS infrastructure, GitHub Enterprise, man in the middle. This is probably the only one that I would categorize as not so relevant, because in AWS typically you get HTTPS out of the box. So I wouldn't see this as very relevant. So I would remove this probably. But most of the other things are spot on. Most of the other things are spot on. In fact, it's even read the DynamoDB and it's not come up with a SQL injection thing. If you Everybody first comes up with SQL injection, right? I don't know how many of you have seen this. Everybody first comes up with SQL injection right off the bat. And it's had the context to understand. We have given it enough context for it to understand that, hey, there's no SQL injection here, but it's clearly been able to understand that if I'm able to gain access to AWS, I'm able to gain access to DynamoDB, which is a NoSQL database. So it's not identified things. It seems more manual efforts only to use prompts for text-based outputs. I didn't understand the question, but uh, manual efforts only to use prompts for text-based output. So you're basically creating what you're doing is you're creating these patterns that are reusable, right? So yeah, you need to have a prompt. Obviously, you need to have the system prompt and user prompt, and using those will give you a much more complete response, or a much more contextual response. I didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question beyond that. Anyway, so the threat analysis is now done. Now the last stage of the threat model, as far as we're doing for this particular session today, is going to be doing the countermeasures. Now, the countermeasures are very fun, because what we're going to do is we're going to feed it the threat scenarios. We're going to feed it the threat scenarios. We are also going to feed it the objectives and the information assets, and we're going to feed it all this data, and we're going to say generate countermeasures. And one of the things that this is going to do is it's going to generate countermeasures in the way NIST is going to require it, right? So NIST requires each countermeasure to have multiple parameters, scoring parameters, the impact of the countermeasure, how to. Yeah, I'm using OpenAI API for this task. I am using OpenAI API. So we are under the hood actually using OpenAI API for this. So yeah. Anyway. So the idea here is that you can use this is going to generate the countermeasures, and it's going to generate the countermeasure as required by NIST. Right? NIST requires you to not only capture the countermeasure but also capture the cost of implementing that countermeasure, whether it's the impact of the cost of acquiring the control, cost of implementing the control, all that stuff. So it prescribes that you capture all of these things Yeah, so I have multiple questions, obviously, as I expected. This is also reducing the amount of false positives as you can be more specific with the prompts. Yes, exactly. You are able to reduce false positives because you can be more. The more specific you are with the prompts, the less hallucinations you can have. And of course, you can change the AI parameters to reduce the hallucinations by using top P and all of those parameters as well. Does this approach give consistent results? Yes, it does. If your prompt is solid, if your prompt is consistent and very specific, it does give you consistent results. So now let's actually go ahead and run the last piece, which is one second. Let me just I'll get to Paula's question in just a little bit, but I'm going to run this example last and get to it. Ashish, that's why the class is for Ashish. Anyway, so that's anyway, so let's get started with running the last piece, which is the countermeasures. So what I'm going to do in this case is that I'm going to generate the countermeasures um, for the situation that I've created, right? So this is the system, this is the security objectives, information assets, threat scenarios, blah, 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 blah. It's going to generate the countermeasures. So I actually have a very interesting question from Paula who says, would you say the effort should be on training the users, developers, or other stakeholders on how to write good information about the product so that it can automatically run a threat modeling process? That is, instead of teaching them to do threat modeling, maybe teaching them how to write better docs. I won't even go so far as to say that, because in most cases you have basic documentation. You need to be able to infer from the existing documentation that you have. I think getting them to do additional things is not going to work. Basically, leveraging existing documents or existing processes should be the way to go. And this, you'll see that the initial what I gave you initially really didn't have much data. It had just enough information that it could glean, and then we broke it down. The step by step thing is very important. Being able to leverage this component breakdown approach is very important. Not trying to go from 0 to 100 in one single step. They're not saying that do this, give me a threat model. No, that will not happen. The AI is going to give you a very poor threat model. It's just like it's not going to be very useful. Whereas if you go about it in a step by step way, in a much more methodical approach, you will get much better results. I hope that answers your question. All right. So now output, you will see the output of the countermeasures. You will see that it has each, so it has taken each threat scenario and created some countermeasures, right? Now, each countermeasure, you'll see that it has a score. So high, medium, low associated with the implementation of those counts. So effectiveness of this is high, acquisition is high. So it actually gives you that. This is required by the NIST. So this NIST methodology that we're using kind of needs this to happen because you want to understand the impact of implementing the control. This is a very nice way of thinking about the problem, if you will. But it's not always that you need to do this, right? Let's say your approach to doing threat modeling or your company's approach to doing threat modeling doesn't require you to do this. You don't need to do this, right? This is just, I wanted to show you a slightly different perspective on how to frame controls. And you will see that a lot of these are very contextual. And we remember, throughout the process, we have essentially cut down the possibility of hallucinations happening, right? Since we have cut down the process of hallucinations happening throughout the process, we've been able to essentially come up with a much more, very, very tight, very, very relevant, very, very specific threat model. Yeah, I understand you're doing this based on NIST, but can I do it? Yeah, absolutely. You can do it based on your company's internal security policies, tweak it. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You can do whatever you mentioned. It's entirely. So the reason it's coming up with this output is because I've trained it to do NIST, or I've not trained it, training is the wrong word. I've essentially prompted it to use a certain approach with a certain set of predefined formats and examples. But you can use completely different approaches. In fact, you'll see that you'll see, I mean, there's another demo and I want to show you, which is a very interesting demo, but you'll see that in all the examples that we have, we're doing very different types of threat models. So it's not just one type of threat model. So even in the boot camp, we will do different types of threat models, break down the process in a very, very meaningful way. So that's how we do things. But absolutely, you can. You can. All right. Any questions besides this? I hope I answered most of the questions. Um, but yeah, this is one of the things. So this approach, you'll see that within a few minutes, we started at 4 or 5 minutes back, and within 5 minutes, we've had a very, very usable threat model, if you will. Right? Obviously, there are a few things that you can do to improve it, things that you can do to make it better, make it more specific, maybe add a few things, remove a few things, whatever it is. But you'll realize that it's very, very easy to do with this as you get into this process. Anyway, and all of this is done through the vision approach and using vision tools and all of those things. Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, I would say that. So Paula's question is, I believe the goal is to give AppSec teams to handy tool to do routine tasks, beware of hallucination. If you are able to tune your prompts well, hallucinations do reduce quite a bit through that process. And additionally, also, I see this more as a very powerful tool for our powerful approach for not just developers, but even for existing security teams, because they can come up with much better processes around it for. You've said AppSec, sorry, my bad, but even developers or security people who are running this product. All right. I have one more demo. I hope you can give me some time to share that. I know I'm a little bit over an hour, but I just want to make sure that I share that. That's a very interesting demo. I just wrote for this webinar. I wrote that demo. It's very interesting. So, in fact, you can do this. What we did was a system threat model. You can do, in fact, in the bootcamp, we also talk about agile threat modeling, and we use the LLM to generate agile threat models for each user story, generate abuser stories, threat scenarios, mitigations, and security test cases, and so on. So it actually becomes you can use it for different types of threat models. You can even use this for rendering questions for your security architecture review. So the other things you can do with this is more advanced implementations is to use RAG. So let's say you have a lot of existing knowledge bases like vulnerability scan reports or threat intelligence reports. One of the things you can do is also leverage RAG, which is an approach where you load all this data into vectorized databases, and you can leverage AI to not only generate what it generates, but also use your data to augment from what it generates. So it becomes much more contextual, much more specific to your use case, right? So that is something that you can do. You can also use agents, and my last demo is actually on agents before I move on to the details of the boot camp that we have. So one of the things that I was thinking about is why not have um AI do the whole thing, right? Basically, write do the whole thing from scratch. Basically, come up with the entire thing, the entire threat model from scratch, right? This is what I want to do. Take the entire thing, take the image, read that, and work like as if a human being is working through it, right? It's a full-fledged automated threat model. So can that be done? And with AI, with agents, it can be done to a certain extent. I want to show you that. And so this basically is like a thinking system. So it takes different tasks and it first reads. Oh, oh, it does. Okay. It reads the information from the context file. Then it reads the image. It breaks down all the components of the image, and you see that it's thinking through. Just like in LLMs, you have something called agents where you can hook it up with different tools, and you can actually get it to run a full thinking process, like as if it's thinking. It's actually just taking each task and using an LLM to process that task. And in this case, you'll see that it's reading the image, then it's going to create the component list based on the image, then it's going to create the security objectives based on that, then it's going to create the threat scenarios based off of those set of components, and then it's going to come up with your threats. It's going to stop at threat scenarios. It doesn't go to countermeasures, but you can, of course, make it go to countermeasures as well. I'm not sure what's happening here, whether it's doing or not. This is why you should not run live demos, because some way, shape. I just ran this before the start of the webinar, and for some reason, it is kind of flaking on me. While this is running, let me just share some information about the bootcamp that we have. So the bootcamp that we have is on June 6th and 7th. So you will have 2 days of live session, live online. Learn this from me. You also get certificates for this. You get a full year of AppSecEngineer Pro Plus, which gives you access to cloud, all of the cloud sandboxes and stuff. You also get our OpenAI LLM sandbox, which means that you don't need to have ChatGPT Plus or OpenAI Plus for this. Uh, you will get, for people who attended this webinar and who kindly sat through this entire webinar, you have a $300 discount um, using the code months to minutes. So if you use the code months to minutes, you get $300 off on this bootcamp. So this is going to be a very one of its kind bootcamp. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested, if you want to scale this process, if you want, and if you want to scale this process in your organization and want this training for your organization, let us know. We can definitely make that happen. But this is going to be a very interesting bootcamp. I'm going to bring a lot more demos to this, lot more interesting use cases, just like I've brought in with this. You can see that it's actually doing something now. So it actually read the diagram, got all the components, it's doing the rest. Now it's going to generate a security objectives, list of security objectives. So that's what it's doing. Now I'm going to share this um, slide deck. I'm going to make it public. So those of you who are interested can take a look. I can't seem to post comments to LinkedIn, but if one of the members of my team can, it would be great. My streaming software is not allowing me to post comments to LinkedIn for some reason. So you'll see that it actually generated the threat scenarios. You'll see that it went from doing the security objectives. It captured it captured the diagram. It broke down the diagram. It created the security objectives. It created the threat scenarios. Created the security objectives, and it's going to finally write all of this to a markdown file. Right. So this is something that is really powerful with this. So it can actually go from a zero to a complete threat model, just like through the AI driven agent system that we have. Yeah. So you'll see that it's basically thinking through each and every problem, and then finally it's going to write the threat scenarios. I am not able to share the link related to the slide deck. Oh, yeah, thanks, Bharat. Appreciate it. Thanks. So you'll see that it actually generated the threat actors, it generated the threat. So it's thinking through, just like an individual thinks through the problem, it actually thinks through the whole thing, and it is able to come up with threat scenarios. Just gonna give it another couple of minutes. Sometimes it takes a little bit more time because again it's probabilistic. AI, remember, is probabilistic, so it's not always that it will have this very exact series of events based on what you give it, based on the evaluation process that it has. It gives you, it goes through different steps in different stages. Yeah, you'll see it's done. So in fact, if you see, it's actually generated the threat scenarios right here. So all of these threat scenarios are for our expense management system. And this was done entirely through an automated threat modeling session. A user didn't have to do anything. We had the same context, just like you saw in the previous example. we had the same everything, except in this case that we used an agent-driven approach. And when an agent-driven approach like this, you'll see that it captured the entire threat scenarios from it. That it did each step like a breakdown and captured very relevant threat scenarios. All right. Any questions before we close? Not sure if there are any questions. All right, folks. Thank you very much for attending this session. I hope you enjoyed this particular session on rapid threat modeling with Gen AI and LLMs. This is something that we've been recently working on. Like I said, the course is also very new, constantly being built. New things keep coming up. So I hope you had an interesting session. I hope you learned something. I hope you found this useful. And like I said, if you want to learn this stuff, you know where to go. We have a very interesting bootcamp coming up in June. And that's really it. Thank you so much. And yeah, if you are an AppSec engineer member, you do have access to another very interesting session that I'm doing Thursday, which is doing a live security architecture review. And I'm not going to be using LLMs for that. I'm going to be doing that myself. Anyway, thank you so much for attending. Thank you for being a very good audience. Thank you for staying for a while longer. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.